Foreman Box. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Nice to see you all back. When we broke Mr. Terry was in his closing. Mr. Terry, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Very well.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you had a good lunch. When we broke, we were talking about some of the phone calls, cell records showing contact between Sabrina and Jonathan Hearn. And if you look at all the records, like I said, you will see that their contacts were pretty much daily. When they talk about and focus in on particular days, if you look at all the contacts, you will see that it was all the time. And when you have those records back there, I ask you to look at all the contacts that they had. Why? They were having an affair. They were contacting each other, either texting each other or calling each other every bloody day, almost, it seemed like. Okay? It's not just particular days. But let's talk about the particular days that the prosecution has zoned in on in their case and what they believe it shows. They say that April 24th and 25th are critical days because this is supposedly, according to Jonathan Hearn, when he was going to give her the banana pudding that he put arsenic trioxide in. And you remember when he was testifying about bringing her this banana pudding, he said he made it. He couldn't remember how to, he originally couldn't remember where he got the recipe. Remember that? I questioned him about that, and from the preliminary hearing, he testified that he didn't remember where he got the recipe from. Then the people do a search in his the metadata from his computer or his cell phone, and they find that he did a search for banana pudding, vanilla wafer banana pudding. And again, you remember, my point with regards to this is, if Sabrina was in on it, the easiest thing would have been to do would have to ask her, what's your recipe? Can I have it? So that I make it just like you. And they focus in on the phone calls between them. And as Mr. Smith pointed out, that on April 24th, Jonathan Hearn was calling the home phone of Sabrina Limon, her landline. And he's right, they were. Because why? We find out that in March, Rob Limon had found out about their Gmail accounts and their communications back and forth to each other on the Gmail. And that's when he told Sabrina again and told Jonathan, stay away from each other. And that's when Jonathan began seeking out and obtaining, and as he said, multiple burner phones. And remember, he said he got at least 2 others and the coverage wasn't any good. And then he ended up finally getting the one that Sabrina began using on April 25th. Now also remember, Jonathan said he delivered the banana pudding, according to him, late at night to Sabrina. He said he brought it over late at night. But Rob was working days. There's no evidence presented by the prosecution that Jonathan Hearn was over in Hellendale in the evening hours when he says he was delivering banana pudding, not on April 23rd, not April 24th, and not on April 25th. And Rob only worked at Tehachapi 2 days that month, April 24th and 25th. So how was she supposed to have received the banana pudding from him, if she even knew about it? Which, it's our contention, she didn't know anything about Jonathan Hearn's plan. Remember, he also said he tested a batch of his arsenic trioxide on a neighborhood dog. He put it in salmon and poisoned the neighborhood dog. And I asked him, well, did you see the dog eat the salmon? He didn't remember. Did you see the dead dog? Because he said he checked the weights and everything of Rob and how much of the trioxide you'd have to give him to kill him. But nobody reported any dead dog. Nobody ever found any dead dog. The police certainly didn't turn up any neighbor who had a dead dog. So that doesn't corroborate his story that he was preparing to kill Rob using arsenic trioxide. Also, you remember I asked him, was Sabrina a good mom? Because remember, he had his whole list of all of her attributes and everything, and that she was loving and caring and a good mother. What mother, according to Jonathan, she put this banana pudding in the refrigerator. What mother would ever expose her children to the possibility of being poisoned? Because who knows who would have access to it? And if Rob found it, how do you know he would need it right then and there? Which would blow their supposed whole plan to poison Rob. You also remember that Jonathan Hearn mentioned the fact that part of the reason the plan to kill was to kill Robert up in Tehachapi because they had a lack of medical facilities and response, right? Except remember we heard that the paramedics were at the scene within minutes of Rob being found. So that's number one with regards to when he was actually shot. There were paramedics there and to help and assist with him within minutes of the report by Sean Ware. The other part of it is Defense Exhibit X. Every record of any treatment or injury that Rob Limon suffered when he was working for BNSF. Treatment for any illness, for any injury. Those records were subpoenaed and are part of the record in this case. And are Exhibit X, Defense Exhibit X. You will have an opportunity to review those records. You will find not one incident where Rob Limon sought medical treatment while he was on the job for BNSF. Not one report regarding any treatment in Tehachapi. And that's for the entire time period he was working for BNSF. You remember Jonathan Hearn said, yeah, we were choosing Tehachapi because one of the reasons is they're not quick on response on medical, and there's not a lot of medical facilities to get treatment at. And we know that because Rob had once had a panic attack, he said, while he was on the job up in Tehachapi. That record doesn't exist. It never happened. Pure fabrication by Jonathan Hearn. Now they say her using the burner phone that Jonathan provided, which obviously was the third one that he provided, was because they were trying to, according to Jonathan, trying to cut off any link to them for the police when Rob evidently turned up dead. Except Jonathan didn't bother to get a burner phone for himself. Even though we all know that Rob was aware they had been involved in an affair. We know also that Jason Bernatine knew that Sabrina and Jonathan had been involved in an affair, and that Kelly Bernatine knew that or that Sabrina and Jonathan had been involved in an affair. They all three knew, which would immediately make Jonathan Hearn a suspect. And whose phone are they more likely to get a wiretap on or an intercept on? If he's a suspect, Jonathan Hearn. If they're listening on his phone, they're hearing Sabrina. And they can get her number and get a intercept, like they did in this case, on her phone. So his claim that the basis for getting that phone was to keep it out of the limelight for their connection from law enforcement doesn't quite hold water when you really examine it. The other part of that is, that what we also know is, after Rob found the Gmail account, and prior to Sabrina getting a working cell phone that would work and get reception in Hellendale, there was a lot of communication between Sabrina and Jonathan Hearn on her home phone. But we also know that there's a problem with that is what happens if Jonathan happens to call and it's the kids who pick up, or her sister, or Rob. In other words, he calls when they're home. And remember, Rob talked to him on more than one occasion. And recently, probably would have recognized his voice. So what Jonathan was doing was providing Sabrina with a means so that they could communicate and continue with their affair without Rob knowing about it. And Jonathan was one who purchased the phone. And Jonathan was the one who put on the minutes on the phone so that he could communicate with Sabrina without Rob finding out. Now, one of the other critical dates is the May 23rd, 2014 date. And that's the date where Jonathan went to Tehachapi on a roundabout trip from Monterey after his training session was over. We've got information that he contacted and called Sabrina, spoke to her from basically around the Mettler area to the Edison Highway area, and then it cuts off. And it was a long conversation. We don't know what it was about. Jonathan claims it was about helping him locate Rob's workplace. But as Sabrina has testified, she told him, and the district attorney says that she had told him 6 months before, which would have put it in May. That was a little vague when she gave that statement to the police. Was she talking about 6 months before November when they were talking to her, or 6 months before May? We don't know. They didn't follow up and ask, what date are you actually talking about? When approximately was this? And the other thing is, remember, Sabrina's really lousy with dates. She couldn't remember exact dates of her life dependent upon it. She had difficulty in remembering certain dates throughout her testimony of when things occurred. And even when the police were interviewing her, when she was talking about when she first began seeing or talking to Jonathan Hearn, she was off on that date too, and that time frame. She was trying to remember the best she could. And you got to remember that when she was talking to the police on November 18th, it was extremely stressful. They're accusing her, they're berating her, they're challenging her, and you saw her even on the stand. She has difficulty in being able to effectively communicate. And when you look at a lot of those interviews, if you stop and look at those interviews, oftentimes it's the police constantly barraging her, hitting her with a barrage of questions, and she could barely get a word in edgewise. And I invite you to examine those interviews that they conducted on the 18th and on the 20th, and look at the circumstances all surrounding it and the interrogations that she going under. Now, with regards to that scouting trip, they talked quite a bit before he was in Tehachapi. They talked as he's coming out of Tehachapi. Again, look at the records. I mean, Mr. Smith pointed out that July 7th, when she's down in the beach with her husband in Newport Beach and her kids, she's also talking to Jonathan Hearn for long periods of time. You heard their phone calls. How many? And those were just the intercepts that Mr. Smith played that were of interest to him to prove his case. And you remember that the detective testified about thousands of calls and text messages between the two of them over that time period. How much of them were much about nothing? Because if they proved anything, you would have heard them. from them, from the district attorney. If they thought it proved anything, you would have heard them. But they didn't play all those calls that they intercepted. They only played the ones that they felt helped prove their case. The other ones, they determined, were not relevant. On August 17th, she called Jonathan Hearn twice in the morning, once, I think, shortly before noon, and then there were either calls or text messages to Jonathan Hearn that he didn't respond to because he was gone. Is there any evidence other than Jonathan Hearn's testimony that says Sabrina knew what he was doing? That he was going up to Tehachapi to kill her husband? They presented no evidence that Sabrina knew for certain what Jonathan was up to. And in fact, her testimony was that he had told her he was tired after work, and he wasn't going to be able to come over to see her. Plus, she was busy. Remember, she went to church that day. She was getting the kids. She went over to see her mom because her mom had recently gotten out of the hospital after an injury. She was getting the kids ready for the first day of school and getting all her stuff together for school. She had a busy day. They hadn't got together. Why? Oftentimes when Rob is gone and she's able to, she and Jonathan get together to spend time with each other. If she's able to, and if he's able to. Or they talk, because they can talk for long blocks of time because Rob's not home. You look at all the records and you see that day after day after day. Why? Because they were involved in an affair. If you want to turn that into murder or conspiracy to commit murder, it's a long stretch with that many calls over the length of time of their relationship. And remember, too, Mr. Smith talked about how there were times where she was on the phone at the same time with Jonathan as she was with Rob. Well, we've all done this. I know I have. If you're having to do something else while you're on the phone with somebody, you put the phone down, you go do what you got to do. In this case, she may be calling her husband or checking to see when he's coming home, so she knows how much longer she has to talk to Jonathan. She wasn't getting any responses from her text messages, which you have, and they're part of the evidence of Rob's text messages and phone calls. And then she was calling Rob. And you also heard Sabrina say that her daughter was also calling Rob at the same time in between. Because
the attorneys are arguing their case, ladies and gentlemen. You're the judge of the facts. You'll recall what the facts are and make your own decision. Objection noted, Mr. Smith. Thank you.
that was Mrs. Limon's testimony. Now, Mr. Smith may not agree with me, but that was something she said when he was cross-examining her. And you'll see the text message from Sabrina to Rob on his cell phone that she sent him, asking him to why he hasn't called or contacted her. Leanna wanted to say good night, and they were worried. That is part of the evidence that you have before you. Now, some of the other circumstantial evidence that Mr. Smith brought out were the cards. Particularly, he read the Valentine's Day card from Sabrina from Kay to Jonathan. And then he also read off some of the things in card that she also sent him, which is undated, so I don't even know when that was sent to him. He talked about the gifts, such as the snow globe that she testified about that she gave him for Christmas, December of 2013. Mr. Smith says this shows that she was planning on getting rid of her husband and starting her new life with Jonathan Hearn. That is one way you can look at it. I can't deny that. It is certainly reasonable. It's also reasonable Sabrina believed she was in love with Jonathan Hearn, as she's testified. And she was living a fantasy with Jonathan Hearn. That she bought into the fantasy, and maybe a little too much. She loved her husband. They may have not had a perfect relationship, but she didn't mean she didn't love her husband or to love the father of her children. There's nothing in there that says, oh, by the way, get rid of my husband for me. There's nothing that ever even indicates that Sabrina had that thought in her mind. But Jonathan Hearn sure did. Remember that little laundry list of things he wrote out about how bad a person Rob was, having his wife sleep with other men, having his wife sleep with other women. All these things that he thought were so sinful. And remember, he asked God to kill Robert. I guess Jonathan decided he was going to play God when he killed Robert. When he decided to kill him so that he could have Sabrina to himself. So that Rob was out of the picture. So that he could live that fantasy that he and Sabrina had talked about. But he wanted it. None of these gifts say, kill my husband. None of these gifts say, I'm leaving my husband. None of these gifts say, I want my husband dead. Remember, Mr. Smith talked about how divorce wasn't an option for Sabrina, for the various reasons that Jonathan gave. But we've heard about all the people that were a part of Sabrina's circle of friends, and people she knew, and that Jonathan knew some of, and that we know now. We've got Dale Smith, he and his wife Nicole. They're part of this group. He admitted that he and Rob and Sabrina and his wife had engaged in wife swapping, opened their marriage. They're divorced, and we're going through divorce. There was the fire captain that they talked about. I can't remember his name. Rowe was his name. He's now was part of that also, according to Jonathan. He was also involved in the swing. It was known within the San Bernardino County Fire Department. Evidently, I guess it's a popular thing out there. And he and his wife are divorced. Jason and Kelly Bernatine, who testified here in court, are now divorced. This is not a new concept within the community. It is not like everyone is going to pick sides. There's no evidence that Sabrina ever considered that divorce might not be an option. She obviously at one point, even during one of her interviews, said that she was probably going to leave Rob eventually. Again, maybe not. Again, this is after the fact, after Rob is gone. And she's looking back with hindsight, which, as we all know, is 2020. Now we also have the telephone intercepts of conversations between Sabrina and Jonathan after Robert's death. As Mr. Smith points out, it's definitely evidence of their affair and their discussions about a possible future together. And maybe it's a little more concrete than it was before Rob's death. Mr. Smith again points to this is not normal behavior for a recently widowed woman. But again, before Robert's death, Jonathan was her emotional support. He was what she clung to in with regards to her relationship also with Robert. The thing that was missing in her relationship with Robert, as she's testified to after they opened their marriage, was feelings of being special, feelings of being the only person that they cared about or wanted to be with, feelings of an emotional connection and not just about sex. Jonathan meant all of that to her long before Robert's death. And when she is struggling to get by, as she testified, talking to Jonathan made her feel better. And we certainly heard enough of them praying together throughout those intercepts that were played, not including all the ones that weren't. And with regards to discussions and why it started so quickly, I mean, Jonathan barely gave Sabrina room to breathe after Robert's death, and he was right there. Now, was that intentional on his part to maintain a sense of control over her? Because as we've seen, Sabrina can be somewhat manipulated by the men in her life, or at least influenced by the men in her life, including even her own husband. The opening of their relationship, engaging in the partying they were doing with their adult trips, and their exploits on those trips. She is not a strong person on her own, and she can be managed. And Jonathan needed to maintain that control over her so she didn't stop and think about him as a possible person who could have done this to her husband. And the other reason he probably stayed in close contact with her and constantly, and you can hear it in even the phone intercepts, even though he's saying they're talking in code, when they're talking about the police investigation. She's talking to him because he has knowledge about investigations. He's an arson investigator, he's had some law enforcement training, and he's a firefighter. And he has more knowledge and understanding of this arena than she does. So she's talking to him. When it comes to the DNA evidence, did she understand what DNA even was? Did she know what cybergenetics was? Or true allele? She didn't know any of that. And when Detective Meyer would explain things to her which were oftentimes very limited and cryptic, because he'd already identified her as a suspect in his mind, and he was using it the times he spoke to her as means to trigger to see what she would do to talk to Jonathan Hearn. Well, she's got to rely on Jonathan Hearn to explain what all this means. So she calls him, and he's telling her things such as Don't trust what the police are doing. Don't tell the police about the affair. Don't do this. Don't do that. You listen to the context of those telephone intercepts. It's Jonathan Hearn who's making the inquiries, and it's him who's telling Sabrina what to do. Remember when he told her she was supposed to go see Detective Meyer on Wednesday? And he wanted to talk to her before she went to go talk to Detective Meyer. So he convinced her to put over the interview to Thursday so that he could talk to her. So he could tell her what to say and what not to say. Because he was worried about him being the suspect and being the subject of the investigation. Because when no other suspects are available, that's certainly logical. Somebody who's involved with the wife of the deceased. And the other thing is statistically, after all the education I've had in this arena, at least 90% of all homicides are committed by someone you know, someone you're related to, or someone you've met. So that is a logical suspect, and that's why Jonathan Hearn emphasized to her so much, don't tell him about us. Because he knew he'd instantly be a suspect. And then finally, when he suspected there were phone calls we were being intercepted and were being listened to, he's telling her, okay, go ahead and tell him about our affair. And say, yeah, I know Jonathan Hearn, but he couldn't have done this. Remember, he was telling her what to say. It is that control that he must maintain. The control of the dialogue between, and to sow seeds of distrust between Detective Meyer and Sabrina. Why she would trust Jonathan over him was because she was blinded, because she believed that she was in love with him and thought that he loved her. That's what he did, and that's how he controlled the situation. And that's what you see in those phone call intercepts. And remember, one of the questions, the last questions I asked Detective Meyer when I put him back up on the stand at the end here, how many calls to lawyers did Jonathan Hearn make? 2. How many did Sabrina make? 0. Who shows consciousness of guilt? Where did she go? She went to her kid's school to talk to the teacher. Where did he go? He got on the phone and was calling lawyers because he thought he was about to be arrested. Now, the computer research by Jonathan Hearn, which is some of the other circumstantial evidence that been presented, and they pulled out some metadata from some of his searches, as it's called. Their view is he did certain searches for payouts with regards to life insurance, how long it takes to pay out. Some of it with regards to the arsenic poisoning. This supposedly shows their plan to kill Rob by poison. And then about life insurance payouts, settlements, those types of information. He was actually going on the computer and searching. And then, of course, the search for the recipe for banana pudding. There's no evidence Sabrina knew anything about this research that Jonathan Hearn was performing. There's no evidence whatsoever she knew anything about what Jonathan Hearn was planning or doing, other than Jonathan Hearn saying, well, this was part of our master plan. And when it comes to the issue with regards to life insurance payout, you heard from Sabrina's sister Julie Cordova. Sabrina didn't even deal with the life insurance. she took care of all of that for her, along with Kelly Bernatine, who was also trying to get involved in that aspect of it too, until Julie told her to back off. It was Julie who was dealing with and warning Sabrina about BNSF based upon her experiences when her husband was injured on the job. And telling her what types of things needed to be done and contacting the people at BNSF that needed to get it accomplished, such as the union reps that she was talking to. That was Julie doing that. That wasn't Sabrina. Now, you also heard the testimony that Sabrina gave away after Rob's death. She gave the family boat to Rob's sister. She was trying to give away Rob's car to another friend or family member. And ultimately, they ended up selling that. If this was about money, and her sister told you about the loans that she made where she never expected to be repaid, this was not about money. This was about Jonathan Hearn wanting to be with Sabrina above all else, his obsession, even though he denies it now. But what would it take? Ask yourself, what would it take for somebody to be willing to kill another man to have their wife? And being able to live with that? If he wasn't obsessed with her, then why would he even consider doing that? What kind of sick individual would even consider that as an option? I don't know what snakes are in his brain, but ladies and gentlemen, the bottom line is would any of us ever be willing to kill another human being just because somebody asked us to? I would hope not. I would hope we were better than that. But Jonathan Hearn certainly isn't. That man sat up on that witness stand and described how he went about killing Rob Limon in cold blood as if he was discussing how he brushes his teeth in the morning. He is cold, calculating, thoughtful, plans ahead. Is that Sabrina from what you've seen? Is there any evidence that Sabrina has any of those traits? You've had a look into what type of person she is and how she thinks and how she answers and how she acts. You saw the reaction when she saw the photographs from the trips and from the Facebook of her and Rob and her and Rob and the kids and Rob with the kids. Now, Mr. Smith wants to say that stage. You can't stage that kind of true emotion. Nobody can. That was gut-wrenching emotion coming out because of those memories that it brought up. And that sense of loss all over again. That's what that was. And they tried to paint a picture of her selling her house in Silver Lake. And they thought buying this townhouse in Camarillo, near the beach, getting her beach house. It wasn't a beach house. I worked at Camarillo, so I know it was on the beach. Right up until they found out she didn't own that place. She's renting. How much money did she make off the sale of her house net? $17,000. What does that cover? Paid off her car and moving costs. Why did she move? Because the media and the neighbors were hounding her and the kids. She had to go somewhere else to try to insulate the kids from all this insanity. The other evidence you have, which you can try to draw some inferences from, are Sabrina's statements to the police. And if you look at them from beginning to end, every one of them, you'll see how she was treated by the police. And I'm not saying that they were any way, shape, or form physically threatening, although could be viewed as that. But they kept after her and after her and after her. You remember there was the first hour with Detective Rutledge and Trevino, and they kept hitting her with barrage of questions, and she couldn't believe and didn't want to believe that Jonathan Hearn was responsible for this. She was in total denial. She didn't want to believe he was capable of this. Part of that could be, to be perfectly honest, that denial is feelings of extreme guilt. When I say extreme guilt, think about it. If he is responsible at that time, she believed he was responsible, she brought into her life and into the life of her children cold-blooded killer. And the guilt that she would have felt if she had believed it, if she began to believe it, the guilt she would feel about having exposed her children to that threat of danger. It couldn't be him. That's the guilt she felt. That's what she was feeling at the time. It can't be him. I couldn't have made that mistake. As it turns out, she did. The guilt she felt at having brought that man into her life and exposed her husband to the danger that he ultimately faced. That is the guilt that she had, and the thoughts she had, and what she couldn't accept. And why the constant denials that it was not Jonathan. It couldn't have been Jonathan. It couldn't have been him. He was a fireman. He was an arson investigator. He was a good Christian. A good, devout Christian man. He wouldn't do this. And if I'm wrong, what have I done? I've exposed my children. I exposed my husband to this danger without knowing this loaded gun was walking around to destroy our lives. That's the guilt she felt. Jonathan claims that there are discussions about Robert grew dark. You have an opportunity to review the photos from Facebook. You'll have the text messages between Rob and Sabrina throughout the time that we have that is available. Those will be ones you can see. You can see them constantly sending messages back and forth spontaneously. Rob, I love you. Rob Limon, I love you. It's not she wanted her husband gone and she didn't love her husband. She did still love her husband. Jonathan Hearn also was something she needed and she believed was love. But it was a love she needed from him. She wasn't getting from Rob anymore, or didn't feel like it. Doesn't mean she wanted her husband killed, or that she asked Jonathan Hearn to do it. not asking you to just look at the evidence I pointed out. I'm asking you to look at all the evidence, to examine it, to question everything. That's part of your job as fact finders. That's the judges of the facts. To question everything, to look at everything. With regards to circumstantial evidence, the judges read to you the instruction with regards to that. I did want to go back over it and point out. And it's instruction number 224. And I'll read it to you again. Before you may rely on circumstantial evidence to conclude that a fact necessary to find the defendant guilty has been proved, you must be convinced that the people have proved each fact essential to that conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. Also, before you may rely on circumstantial evidence to find the defendant guilty, you must be convinced that the only reasonable conclusion supported by the circumstantial evidence is that the defendant is guilty. If you can draw two or more reasonable conclusions from the circumstantial evidence, and one of those reasonable conclusions points to innocence and another to guilt, you must accept the one that points to innocence. However, when considering circumstantial evidence, you must accept only reasonable conclusions and reject any that are unreasonable. You're the ones who decide what is a reasonable conclusion. In your mind, each one of you individually must reach that conclusion. If you believe there are two reasonable conclusions that circumstantial evidence can point to, one is that Sabrina knew and this was part of the plan, or she didn't know and Jonathan was deceiving her, you must accept the one that points to her innocence. And you must acquit. That is the law. That is what you have sworn to uphold. Now we have direct evidence from Jonathan Hearn. He's testified about their plans. He's testified about how they talked about killing Rob by poisoning. Except there's no evidence that ever occurred other than from him, his research. And he did go through a lot of steps to get arsenic trioxide. And we saw the jar or the bottle, and they say it's half full. You ever opened a bag of chips? Remember it says it's X number of ounces on the outside, and you look inside and there's a little bit of chips at the bottom. And you're going, that's 6 ounces? They didn't ever measure how much was left to determine whether or not any was gone. It'd be a logical thing to do, wouldn't it? He couldn't say how much he used of the trioxide, if any. He couldn't say how much he used on the dog. He couldn't remember how much he used with Rob. But he said he did all these calculations at the body size and time. He did all this research on arsenic poisoning. And then the strangest thing, it never happens. Or, according to him, Sabrina warned Rob and he didn't eat it. And so according to him, Sabrina told him the bananas had gone bad. I've been eating bananas my entire life. I've seen some that have started out bad. I've seen some that go brown and go to mush. Well, I've always just used those in my banana bread, banana muffins that I make. So they're really not bad. I've never heard of bananas going bad. Just by sitting in a refrigerator. That's totally illogical. Made up by Jonathan, because it never happened. And we also know Sabrina would have never, ever had that in her refrigerator where her kids could have. Not happening. That's absurd and illogical. And not something that she would ever do or be willing to consider doing. Again, I point to the fact that he said that basically the people turned up the metadata where he did searches on recipes for banana pudding. If Sabrina was conspiring with him, again, why not just get her recipe? If she's part of it, how easy is that? Sabrina, how do you make this? They talk all the time. Why not just ask? He didn't do that. He went on, did a search, computer search on how to make it. But we don't even know if it was ever made. We don't know if he ever poisoned a dog. We don't know if any of that's true because there's nothing to support it other than his testimony. Talked about all the dark conversations, no evidence whatsoever other than his testimony. There were these dark conversations where Sabrina was bad-mouthing Rob, talking about how evil he was. It never happened. You heard Sabrina. She would never, ever say anything bad about Rob Lamont. You've heard from every witness who knew Rob. He was a good guy. Help you, he'd be there in a moment. He was a happy guy. They were the perfect team, remember? They were the perfect team. Sabrina and Rob were the most upbeat, perfect team. And they're saying she wants to destroy that? For money? And they talk about this possible $2 million settlement. We also know from her sister Julie, when she was testifying, that they screwed over her husband when he got hurt. Not typical anymore with employers in corporate America, unfortunately. They don't take care of their workers anymore. We've kind of become fungible goods to a lot of people. But it was Julie who was concerned about that, not Sabrina. Her concern was whether or not she had medical and dental coverage for her kids. And we don't know what settlement, if any, there would have been made. For all we know, BNSF would have come in and claimed it was an independent actor, had nothing to do with work. We're not giving you a lead nickel. Had nothing to do with what Rob was doing with his work. They may have given her nothing, in which case we're talking about something that doesn't even exist. He claims, Jonathan Hearn claims, that she was describing how to get to Tehachapi where Rob worked. During their long conversation before, and then they was saying they were talking about the shooting or killing him in Tehachapi after he came out of the Tehachapi grave, out of the canyon there. Don't have any evidence of that. That's just Jonathan Hearn. There's no evidence that was their discussions, and like I said, you look at all the records, they were talking constantly, and you heard a lot of those conversations. Got a little long-winded. A lot of talking about nothing, which is not unusual. How many of us have done that on phone calls? Talk a lot about really nothing. Our day, what we're doing, what you're planning to do. It's talking about your life. And then every time you turned around on these calls, Jonathan was talking about praying. Or Sabrina would talk about praying. Now there was also some references to some biblical verses. Samuel, 2 Samuel, and Psalms 51. Talking about David and his escapades and issues with Bathsheba and killing her husband, getting her husband killed, having an affair with her. A lot of references to that, and notice Mr. Smith never got into that during his discussions in his closing initially. And as you remember, when I questioned Jonathan Hearn's father about that, about 2 Samuel and David and Bathsheba, nowhere in any of those passages, either Psalms 51 or 2 Samuel, does it state that Bathsheba knew what David had done to get her husband Uriah killed so that he could be with Bathsheba. In neither location. And that's important in this case too. Because Sabrina didn't know what Jonathan had done so that he could have her. That's what it was about. And you look at Psalms 51, it's talking about David seeking God's forgiveness for what he had done with the death of Uriah. There's no mention of Bathsheba having to do that same act, or her being involved in that act of contrition. Asking you to look at all of the evidence in this case, to consider it all. Examine the cold-blooded, calculated manner in which Jonathan Hearn testified in this case. The manner in which he described killing her husband. And that was where it got a little curious to me when it came to the shooting. If I may. Remember, Jonathan said, that the silencer was facing towards the opening when he shot the first shot at Robert. He reaches in. The gun's down at the bottom. And then he said he turned the bag. I'm not sure how he did it. And shot Robert with the first shot, with the gun still in the bag. I'm trying to figure out what kind of contortionist could do that, because I haven't figured out how the heck he did it in the first place, if his testimony was true. If the silencer is facing towards the opening, as he claimed it was, and he reached in, the handle of the gun is in the bottom of the bag. How is he shooting through the top? no hole in the bottom, so he didn't shoot through the bottom. But he claimed that this gun and the silencer were both still in the bag when he shot the first shot. I'm not sure how the heck he pulled that one off. That doesn't make any sense to me, ladies and gentlemen. When he testified to that, I was somewhat shocked how he could pull that off. Because this is the bag he said he used to put the gun in. He said the silencer was facing towards the opening at the top. And he said that he reached inside the bag and pulled the trigger and shot Rob in the face the first time. And you remember he also said that the first shot went in an upward direction. Remember that testimony? He said he shot him and it went upward. But you heard the testimony of Dr. Whitmore, shot number 1, which didn't kill Rob, which is why Jonathan had to go back and finish him off, hit the chin area and went at a downward angle towards the back, front to back. That's totally inconsistent with the way Jonathan said the first shot occurred. What makes more sense is that Jonathan reached into this bag, if he had the gun in the bag, had the butt up, pulled it out, and shot him. That would make sense. And since I think he's a little taller than Rob, it may also be logical with a heavy silencer on the end that it was at a downward angle. But trying to reach in and shoot with the butt of the gun at the bottom of the bag and shoot out through the opening, that makes absolutely no sense. And remember, too, when I questioned Detective Meyer and the other crime scene detectives with regards to whether or not there was any evidence of bullet strikes, remember me asking about that? And Detective Meyer said there was evidence of only one bullet strike. And that was in the ceiling, where it broke the light. Now we know there was only 2 shots fired. One hits Rob here, comes out the back, and that's the only through and through we have. There's no bullet strike in the walls, behind him, or anywhere else in the vicinity, because remember Detective Meyer said he looked. There was no strikes on the floor, there were no strikes on the wall behind, but somehow there's a light getting broken by a bullet in the ceiling, which is 15 to 18 feet up above. So again, Jonathan's version of the events doesn't quite match up with what the evidence shows. So he's not being truthful with regards to how this occurred. And also remember, one of the things he kind of skipped over is he said because of the silencer being as long as it was, that the slide wouldn't fully put a new round into the chamber of the gun to fire a second time. Which he means he had to manually pull the slide back and put a new round in the chamber, put the slide back into firing position in order to pull the trigger. Which means he also had to collect his brass. What that means is the shell casing that comes out of the gun, he's having to collect and keep. And the question that always came to my mind with regards to all of this is the inconsistencies in what he's saying happened and what the physical evidence says happened. Does it mean he didn't kill Rob? No, it doesn't mean he didn't kill Rob. He's admitted to it. He's confessed to it. He's testified to it. but the way he says things happen don't exactly match up with what the physical evidence shows. So he's being untruthful with regards to that in some way or for some reason. The other thing that he talked about was the disguising of his motorcycle and all of this, and that he talked about with Sabrina. You got to remember, we don't know how many times Sabrina actually saw his motorcycle before she was shown the photos by the police. How many opportunities? Remember, the only thing she could describe about his motorcycle was that it says "forgiven" on the side of the gas tanks. That was all she could remember about it. She doesn't know anything about motorcycles. She doesn't know anything about mufflers or any of that. All she remembers is this airbrushed "forgiven" that Jonathan had painted onto the tanks of his motorcycle. And when she was speaking with Jonathan, regard to the call intercept that Mr. Smith played, she asked him, "Is it even running?" She didn't even know. Now, Mr. Smith, during his closing, pointed out the one point where she was talking about, having the headache after she had been reviewing the video, and that she had a headache, and she said, "Why is it a video of you? Why is the video of you?" Well, you got to remember, if you go back to some of the earlier calls, there's a point at which where Jonathan, she's gotten the video for the first time. She's looked at it, and she's beginning to question it and trying to see if she can recognize who it is. You got to remember, it's a fairly short clip, a fairly short period of time where she actually can see the person, and even then, some of the features are hidden by the helmet, by the visor, those types of things. She's struggling trying to recognize the person. And Jonathan Hearn, in one of those intercepts, and you'll have them back there, basically says to her when she's reviewing this, and this is on, by the way, November 17th when she gets this. She's reviewing it, and he says, "Well, they could have gotten a video of me from anywhere and then sent it to you saying this is our suspect." He's telling her what to think. He's telling her how to view the evidence. But remember, you'll have that intercept back there, and her response would be, "Why would Detective Meyer do that?" Because Jonathan said they could have gotten that video from me from anywhere, and then they showed it to you. Detective Meyer, why would Detective Meyer do that? Why? What's starting to happen now? Questions are starting to come to Sabrina's mind. Is Jonathan involved in this? Did Jonathan do this? She's trying to figure it out. She's struggling with it. She's still in denial. It couldn't have been him. It can't be him. But she's starting to realize it's him. And then she's told by the police that they've got DNA evidence. She's told that they've got, all of this evidence against Jonathan, and he's admitted his involvement, and all these things that they're telling her during the interrogations, and telling her what to say, especially the interview with Detective Meyer and Detective Brewer. They're telling her what they want to hear. And remember, this is the funniest part to me, the end of that interview, Detective Brewer is frustrated. And Detective Trevino comes in and says, 4 hours and 40 minutes, and you didn't tell us anything. You're under arrest. You didn't tell us anything. 2 days later, when she's about ready when she's downtown to go to court, they come in and interview her again. And now she's willing to tell them what they want to hear. She's willing to tell them what they want. And remember, through all of this, What did they have when they arrested her on November 18th of 2014? They'd already searched Jonathan's house. They had those notes. They had their cell phone records. They had the phone call intercepts. They had her phone to review her messages and the phone calls that she had with Jonathan Hearn on the burner phone and on her own cell phone. They searched her residence. They'd gotten the notes that Jonathan had left in the brown shorts that they found in the laundry basket. They had all of that. And then they had her 3 statements that she gave to the police. They had all of that on November 18th, 2014. And on November 20th of 2014, the district attorney realized they didn't have enough evidence to charge her with anything. So they let her go. Up until January of 2017, when at the behest of Robert's family, they made a deal with the devil. They made a Faustian deal so that they could get Sabrina. And remember, Jonathan Hearn had been in custody since November of 2014. He didn't talk to the police when he was arrested in November of 2014. He knew all the things that he had done. He knew about all the phone intercepts that were obtained by the police. He knew about all the phone calls and text messages between them. And he knew all the actions he had taken. And that's when they made their deal with that devil, he, to save his own hide, came in and spun his story so that he would have a day out of prison in the future and to take away her life. They made a deal with a cold-blooded killer so they could get her. Because he gave it to them on a silver platter. Before January 3rd of 2017, they didn't know bupkis, and that's Yiddish for nothing, about the poison. He told them about that. He told them where to find it. He knew what he'd done. And he told them where it was. He hung on to it from April, when he got it, until November 18th, and kept that in reserve for himself. He knew what he had done. He had it. If he wanted to get rid of it, he's a firefighter. He kept making up excuses as to why he couldn't get rid of that particular poison. He worked in a fire department that regularly gets rid of poisons. Oh, well, yes, but they would know it was me who brought it in. Nobody knew anything about the poison until you told them. And then once he had them hooked with that little tale that he'd spun for them, he then gives them another statement. And they go back. And now he tells them where to find the items in his storage shed, chicken coop, which had been there since August of 2014. Think about it. Because the police didn't bother to do a thorough search when they had a search warrant, there's a possibility that man, if he hadn't have confessed, could have got away with murder. Because they didn't bother to do a thorough search. Because it was dusty and dirty. And what do they find in there? They find the backpack, they find the silencer, they find the back screen portion of the laptop that had been stolen from the shop up in Tehachapi. They find some of the clothing, the shoes he wore. They find bullet fragments from the practice rounds that he fired off, I guess, when he was testing out his silencer. Because they didn't bother to do a good job of searching. Oh, and by the way, then they find things in a room freshener he tells them about. Remember the thumb drives and that type of stuff? He left in a room air freshener. He tells them about that. They didn't find that during the search of his house either. Not to mention other things that they hadn't found before and didn't seize before, including, as we now know too, the snow globe that Sabrina had given him over a year and a half, or 3 years ago. 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago for Christmas. That man had a chance to walk out of here because they didn't do a thorough search of his residence, and he had it in reserve to save his own hide. Is he cold? Is he calculating? Is he thorough? Does he plan? All of those things. This is what Jonathan Hearn is. Jonathan Hearn is a killer. And he hung on to all those things as a way to save his own hide. Not because he was incompetent. Why would you just get rid of half the stuff you had rather than all of it? Why would you immediately after the death of a man you just killed contact his wife and continue to contact his wife and continue to contact his wife whom you've been having an affair with? That would immediately make you a suspect. Why would you send a letter to Jason Bernatine apologizing for having used them to meet Sabrina right after you killed her husband? What kind of twisted logic is that? It's going to immediately make you a suspect. And I'll give the Bernatines credit, they're suspicious to begin with. Obviously, I don't know of many of my friends that would go around noting what license plates are out in front in the vehicles in front of my house. A little bit nosy, busybody, but in this case, it led to Jonathan Hearn, whom they already knew Sabrina was having an affair with. Long before this. Going back to 2013, they knew this. But it wasn't until September, after September 8th letter was received, that they even mentioned it to the police. And you heard Jason Bernatine talking about all the text messages and calls, voicemail messages he got from Jonathan Hearn, how complimentary they were and how flattering they were. That's how Jonathan works. He tries to be charming and flattering. And we saw that also from Ms. Lentz, Jennifer Lentz, who testified yesterday. The same time he's supposedly madly in love with Sabrina and plotting to kill her husband, he's burning up the phone lines, texting, calling, sending pictures of himself, receiving pictures of her on his phone. All at the same time he's supposedly madly in love with Sabrina and he's making time for another woman. And you'll have those records back there. There's a defense, I believe, Exhibit W, I think it is, if I remember correctly, which are Jonathan Hearn's cell phone records for November through approximately February, March of 2014. And the number of contacts, text messages, phone calls, photos being sent back and forth between the two of them during that entire time period, where he's claiming that he and Sabrina are already plotting to murder her husband. And he also knew Jennifer Lentz when he first was making time with her, as she talked about this back in 2012, which is about the same time he's also first meeting Sabrina. They were talking to each other via Instagram and text messaging and calling, communicating back and forth to the point where her husband found out about it and confronted her about it. And that Jonathan knew she was married and that she was older than he. There's a pattern with this man with regards to the women he's attracted to, which are married and older. And if you remember Jennifer saying he didn't, he sounded very intelligent, sophisticated, didn't seem like he was 22 years old, which is what he would have been at the time. Seemed very mature. This is how he works. This is what he does. And how complimentary he was. And how charming he was. It's the same thing. Woman whose marriage is having difficulty, saying the right thing, charming them, complimenting them, all the things that they're missing in their lives at that time, he uses to get into their life. That's how he works. Ladies and gentlemen, when you go back there to begin your deliberations again, Mr. Smith will have another opportunity to talk to you and rebut, as we call it, basically questioning some of the things I've just said. I won't have the opportunity to get up and talk to you again. This is my last chance to kind of go over some of the issues that I see with this case and what the evidence has been so far. And I'm not saying that you just buy what I say. That's not what your job is. That's not what you're supposed to do. Any more than just buying what Mr. Smith says. Because that is not the evidence. We point out some of the issues we see with what the evidence presents. We try to point out the areas where there are questions that can be raised and issues that need to be addressed by you. But ultimately, the decision and the fact-finding job that you have is to question everything and make your own decision once you've had an opportunity to review all the evidence. And you're to do that without any prejudice or bias against either side. I honestly believe that Detective Meyer and Mr. Smith are doing what they believe is right, and they're doing their job. That is what they're here for. Mr. Smith is an advocate on behalf of the government. He represents all of us here in this state as a representative of the government. I represent one individual, and that's Sabrina Limon. And I'm asking you to do your job. No more, no less. To examine all the evidence in this case, to question it all, to discuss it thoroughly among yourselves, to try to reach a just and right decision in this case. Mr. Hearn's already taken away Robbie and Leanna Limon's father. Don't let him take away the mother too. I ask that when you consider all the evidence, you've looked at everything and questioned everything, you find my client not guilty of these charges. Again, I thank you for your attention. listen to me, and I guess there's been some comment that I need to use an inside voice. As my wife pointed out, that is his inside voice. I apologize again for my volume. I don't mean to break anybody's eardrums. That's just how I grew up and how I talk. I thank you for your attention in this case and for your efforts once you're back in that jury room and deliberating and weighing the evidence in this case. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Terry. Let's take our afternoon recess. Everybody back in 15 minutes, 3:15. Remember not to form or express any opinion or discuss the case. See you back at 3:15.
seated. Come to order, Department 6 in session.
All right, we'll go back on the record in People versus Limon. She's present in court with her attorney and the people are represented. We do have all 12 plus 4 in the box. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Smith will give his summation now. Mr. Smith, please.
Just wanted to initially go over a few things that the defense talked about and show some photographs. There'll be a packet in the back. This is People's 39. He talked about the firearm, the hole in the bag. You'll see throughout the photographs there's a hole in the bag at the top. And you will see, I can show you on the overhead. It's the bag he just showed you. There's a hole in the bag at the top. You also see in the same packet of photographs, there is also a plastic bag with gunpowder residue on it that was in the bag. As it relates to the bullet ending up in the light, if you'll notice in the photographs, the fridge was open and Rob was near the fridge. The way the bullet ends up in the light is if Robert's bending into the fridge, the bullet ends up back here. So it's perfectly possible. There's no issue to that whatsoever. The bag has a hole in it. We found the gun. We found the silencer. If Rob was bending over, the bullet heads up and hits a light. There's a bullet directly below it. All the physical evidence backs up what Jonathan Hearn testified to. One of the other things defense brought out, Defense Exhibit X, there is mention of Mr. Limon having a Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's a chronic polyneuropathy syndrome. So he did have a syndrome similar to what was testified to, that he had a medical issue by Jonathan Hearn. That is in the records towards the end, so you'll have those in the back. One of the things that I did want to point out is I think there's been two kind of shiny objects that the defense has kind of used in this case. One is sex. One is the children and emotion. Starting out with sex, now the defense is arguing that she was being slut-shamed, or that's why she didn't talk to police. But you recall during her testimony, the big issue was control, and she wasn't allowed to speak out of her group. So now she's changed. Now it's slut-shaming, whereas in trial she testified something different. At one point she even testified that Rob controlled her. That was what she was saying at the time. Of course, the contention that was throughout the trial is ridiculous because both Dale Smith, when he talked to Detective Meyer, told him all about the open relationship. Jason and Kelly, when they talked to Detective Meyer, talked all about what was going on. And she even said when she...
Same admonition I'll give you for both attorneys. Attorneys are arguing their case. You're the judge of the facts. Remember what the facts are. Apply a lot of the facts and make your decision. Noted for the record, Mr. Terry. Thank you.
Jason and Kelly, who have been contended by the defense as part of this group, are the ones that initially contacted law enforcement. So this contention that there's this supposed rule that kept Ms. Limon from talking to law enforcement has not been adhered to by anyone that was part of this supposed group. You'll have evidence in the back about this open relationship that occurred back in 2008. How is 2008 have anything to do with this case? Why did we have to hear Dale Smith testify about something in 2008? Not relevant at all. And then also, speaking about emotions, you'll have a jury instruction, number 200. It says, do not let bias, sympathy, public opinion, there's some other ones, influence your decision. And that is what the defense has tried to do. The defense just did it. Don't take away their mom. This is a court of law. You're supposed to come here and apply reason to facts. You're not supposed to sit up there and go, don't take away their mother. That is directly in contravention of a jury instruction. That's not what you're here for. It's not supposed to be said. The trial is an objective look at the facts. The trial is an objective look at, did Sabrina Limon commit this crime? That's it. That's it. And how do you know that the defense was pandering to sympathy? Why was the question, do you miss your mom, asked to Leanna on the stand? I didn't object and I didn't ask any questions because for them to come here and testify to things that adults could have testified to is unseemly and beneath this trial. But that's what they did because they wanted to give sympathy. That's the only reason for it. Do you miss your mom? Of course she misses her mom. But that's not what we're here for. We're here for, did Sabrina Limon commit the crimes? Facebook photos. Why did we have to go through them twice? Twice? We went through them twice so Miss Limon could cry. It's about sympathy. That's it. There are 2 photos containing your husband from 2014. You heard the evidence on that day. She talked to Jonathan Hearn for 5 hours. 80 text messages back and forth. But she's crying up on the stand, not once, but twice over the same photographs. Well, okay, that's July. Well, where's the photos from August when they got killed? Where's the photos of her and Rob in June when they were planning? What about May when they were planning? What about April when they were working on the poisoning? What about March? What about February? Oh, they're not there. So all you have from the date when this was all being planned and worked towards is 2 photos which, if you know all the facts of that day, don't match up to the emotional antics that we got out of Miss Limon. And then if you look at the packet, look at how many photographs are from 2012. 2012, she wasn't even having the affair with Jonathan Hearn. So why do we see those? Again, it's sympathy. That's the only reason. It's reaching out and trying to get you to have an emotion attached to this case, and it's not supposed to happen because you're here to look at the facts. You're here to look at it with reason, not with emotion. That's the job of the juror. So you have to reject that type of approach. You have to reject it. What Leanna wants in this case has no significance. What Robbie wants in this case has no significance. But there are 3 victims of what happened in this case. That's Robert, that's Robbie, and that's Leanna. They are victims in this case. But you must put out of your mind what their desires might be. What she did in this courtroom, Jonathan testified that she always came with emotions. That's what she did. That's what drew him back in, and you saw it. That's exactly what the defense offered to you. They wanted to give you that emotion, to draw you in. Oh, don't you feel sorry for her? Oh, by the way, she was on the phone 5 hours that day with the guy. Oh, wait, that's a little different. Oh, let's look at him twice. Don't let that affect your decision making. Talk about some general concepts of conspiracy. I like to throw this photo in because it kind of helps me explain conspiracy. Now, what you have in this photo is 2 guys fishing out of a boat. So think of conspiracy as fishing. Now, in this case, what we have is a lot of kind of snapshots of different moments in time. That's what this is. This is a snapshot of one moment in time. But what can you infer in the circumstantial evidence from this case? You got 2 guys in a boat, both fishing. Well, you can infer from that, based on the circumstantial evidence, they agreed to go fishing. They're both sitting in a boat. You didn't see them push the boat off of the truck or off the trailer. You didn't see them get into the boat. You didn't see them cast their line, but you know that they agreed to because they're both standing in the boat fishing. That's what this case is. This case is about snapshots in time, actions taken in time. And based on what they're both doing, you can infer that they agreed to do that. That's what a conspiracy is. And what a conspiracy is, to get to the meat of it, you have to take one of them and ask them, hey, what did you guys decide to do? It's a criminal conspiracy. People are not going to raise their hand and go, hey, here's what I did. This is what you have to do in criminal cases. The actions show an agreement. The actions show a plan. The wiretap's November 7th, just for an example, a snapshot. Sabrina is told by somebody connected with law enforcement. She trusted him. That's what she said on the stand. Somebody wanted this done to Robert. The arrest of who did this to Robert, and phone lines could be tapped to get a confession of who did this to Robert. That's the implied thought there. So what did they do? They immediately began to worry that their phones were tapped. So how do you get from phones lines are going to be tapped to get a confession of the person who committed this crime to worried about the phones being tapped? Well, that's a snapshot in time because you're the ones that committed the crime. That's how you get there. Sabrina talked about she heard clicking. There was a voice over the internet phone call. There was a station phone call to do law enforcement countermeasures. All of these things are a snapshot in time that lets you, as circumstantial evidence, see that there is an agreement to commit murder. Also, the false narrative. This whole thought process that Jonathan Hearn controlled Sabrina, it's not in the wiretaps. It's based solely upon what she said. There was a Robert Limon replacement plan. You are my partner in this life. You will, to live for God. I'm ready to live life fully with you. These things were not present when she was arrested originally. We have her phone records. You'll have these in the back downloaded. This is People's 99. You will see that the text messaging only goes back to the 17th of November. So the differences in this time frame is now we have the contents of Jonathan Hearn's cell phone. Now we're able to see, based on her own words, what she did immediately after. We didn't know that until this point in time, until we downloaded the phone. Now we get to see her words. Her words include such thing as plan, God's purpose, all of these things which tie directly in to the wiretaps, which we did not have before. And then there is the talk of Sabrina's real love. Like I said, you can't listen to sympathy, passion. You have to read what is there. This is what Sabrina wrote. October 18th, 2014. I am in love with you deeply, a love that I've never felt before. Exclamation part. That is unequivocal. That is her real love was Jonathan Hearn. That's what she wrote. She wants to testify now. She doesn't know what she was thinking at the time. Well, her words pointed out. I put in more than one. How's the love of my life this morning? That's unequivocal as well. That's Jonathan Hearn. Her husband has just deceased. Now we know what their plan was, that they had a plan based on her own words. Now we know that she has indeed replaced Robert Limon with Jonathan Hearn based on her own words. Initially, those words, we did not have them. This is not a case of he said, she said. This is a case of he said, she lied. That's what I'm calling it. You can look at the evidence. It will be there in the back for you. To have accomplice testimony, it is required that the accomplice, and Jonathan Hearn is an accomplice, accomplice's statement is supported by other evidence you believe. That's that's up on the table here. That supporting evidence is independent of the accomplice's statement. Supporting evidence tends to connect. So that's what you have to have an accomplice statement supported by the evidence sufficient for you to believe. Well, in this case, what do you have? You have arsenic trioxide being located. You have Gmail searches. You have cell tower information. You have cell phone call records backing up the testimony. You have phone notes downloaded that depict the actions. You have items seized in the searches subsequent to the arrest. You have Sabrina's cards describing the future. You have Sabrina's text messages talking about future plans and buying things for the home, which we didn't have before. You have their actions after Robert died. You even had defense witness Jennifer Lentz corroborate Jonathan Hearn. He said, all we did was have text messages and meet one time. What did she say? They text messaged and met one time. Everything that Jonathan Hearn testified to is corroborated by the evidence, by cell records, by items seized, by phone context. And what are you left with the foundation of the defense case? Sabrina Limon. That's what you're left with. And based on her testimony, she lied to law enforcement at every turn. I don't know how that's even up for debate. There are so many lies in there, it is unbelievable. Talked about contact with her husband on the day of the murder, but left Jonathan out. She also said, I continually called my husband at work that evening because I was worried. She was on the phone with Jonathan. And I went over every single one of those calls with her and asked her if she made that call. And she said she did. That is the reason I argued she was on the phone while making the calls, because of her testimony. She fantasized about the future. That's her testimony now. It's not a fantasy if you're buying things. It's not a fantasy if you're doing an action. It's a plan if you're doing an action. She lied about that. She lied about wanting the crime being solved. The excerpt is in evidence where she was happy that they had no evidence. She lied about not worried about the BNSF investigation. After I asked her that question, I put the wiretap into evidence. You hear her voice. It's in the excerpt in evidence. She lied about the video. The reason I put transcripts up there is you can't jumble the words. It's in evidence. The words were up on the screen for you. She knew who was in the video. They would rather take a picture of you. That's what her words were. Not, why are they taking a picture of you? She lied about not knowing who's in the description. John. She immediately called John, tall, white, skinny, motorcycle, beef with Rod. She lied about being confused. She was not confused. As I said before, she even talked to Jonathan about his motorcycle. She lied about the relationship, even after arrest. Those slides that were up before, until they told her about all the stuff. We had had a relationship. We hadn't had a relationship since April. All of those things are constant, continual lies. She was worried about an impending court case. Again, the excerpt is in evidence. Lied about the relationship, lied about being controlled. Look at her writings. Look at her actions. Listen to her words. Listen to some of the wiretaps. Hey, baby, really, she's controlled? What in any of those wiretaps make you think she's controlled in her relationship with Jonathan Hearn? She said Jonathan wouldn't stop coming around. Again, miss you, wish you were here. All those words, none of that means, oh, stop coming here. But now she wants to testify to that. The cell phone information, it gets as simple as this. And just to break it down, this is a cell phone record of Sabrina Limon. Under contacts information for Jonathan Hearn's phone, she has him in as balance check. It gets down to, even in a burner phone, she doesn't have his name. She has him under balance check. Why? Because they wanted to escape law enforcement protection. It is not reasonable to base reasonable doubt on Sabrina Limon's statements. Nothing that she said has any foundation in actual evidence. You have all of her words. You have all of her protestations of love. You have all of her audio protestations of love to Jonathan Hearn. And it's completely contrary to what she testified to. All of the things that she testified to that happened, none of those things are contained in the evidence. It is not reasonable to rely on Sabrina Limon's testimony.
I think Robert fell. He was bombed by somebody, and the guy's got a gun in his hand. You know what I mean? Can you imagine? I thought about it a lot. Like what was going through his mind, how was his heart racing? He's scared. He's thinking about his kids, his wife. This guy's trying to murder him. For what? So he could have his life. This guy wanted Robert's life. This guy murders him in cold blood. But I'm like, I think Robert fell. I mean, he gotta be fucking scared. You know what I mean?
I just wanted to know if he suffered. He said he didn't suffer. I didn't know details of.
Who are we talking about in that audio? We're talking about Jonathan Hearn. I told him where Robert worked. This guy is taking his life. And what does Sabrina Limon say? She says, I just wanted to know if he suffered. And he said he didn't suffer. That's all she wanted to know. That's all she wanted to know. She didn't want to know the details. She just wanted to know that he didn't suffer. And he told her he didn't suffer. That's it. That's her statement. That's what she asked Jonathan Hearn. She just wanted to know if he suffered. And he said he didn't suffer. Sabrina Limon knew Jonathan Hearn killed her husband. That's what that statement points to. Sabrina Limon knew, based on her statements to law enforcement, that Jonathan Hearn had killed her husband. Sabrina Limon planned the murder of her husband with Jonathan Hearn. That's in the evidence. That's in the text messages. That's in the pre-planning. That's in the cell phone locations. That's in the wiretaps. It's throughout. It's replete throughout. She needs to be held accountable for what she did with Jonathan Hearn. She needs to be held accountable for letting her husband suffer, because he did. She took him away from the family. She's the one who set it in motion. She's the one, along with Jonathan Hearn, not saying somehow Sabrina Limon's more guilty of crime than Jonathan Hearn. She did this with Jonathan Hearn. And that's why we're here. That's why we've been here for weeks on end. Because crimes such as these demand that everybody be held accountable in some way. And that's why we're here. Because this case requires that everyone be held accountable. And that includes Jonathan Hearn, who has been held accountable, and Sabrina Limon. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Smith. I do have a few concluding instructions for you, okay? When you go to the jury room, the first thing you should do is choose a foreperson. The foreperson should see to it that your discussions are carried on in an organized way and that everyone has a fair chance to be heard. It is your duty to talk with one another and to deliberate in the jury room. You should try to agree on a verdict if you can. Each of you must decide the case for yourself, but only after you have discussed the case and the evidence with the other jurors. Do not hesitate to change your mind if you become convinced that you were wrong, but do not change your mind just because other jurors disagree with you. Keep an open mind and openly exchange your thoughts and ideas about this case. Stating your opinions too strongly at the beginning or immediately announcing how you plan to vote may interfere with an open discussion. Please treat one another courteously. Your role is to be an impartial judge of the facts, not to act as an advocate for one side or the other. As I told you at the beginning of the trial, do not talk about the case or about any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including but not limited to your spouse or other family, friends, spiritual leaders, advisors, or therapists. You must discuss the case only in the jury room and only when all the jurors are present. Do not discuss your deliberations with anyone, and do not communicate using any social media network or device during your deliberations. It is very important that you not use the internet, a dictionary, or any other reference materials in any way in connection with this case during your deliberations. During the trial, several items were received into evidence as exhibits. You may examine whatever exhibits you think will help you in your deliberations. These exhibits will be sent into the jury room when you begin to deliberate. If you need to communicate with me while you are deliberating, send a note through the bailiff signed by the foreperson or by one or more members of the jury. To have a complete record of this trial, it is important that you not communicate with me except by a written note. If you have questions, I will talk with the attorneys before I answer, so it may take a little time. You should continue your deliberations while you wait for my answer. I will answer any question in writing or orally here in open court. Do not reveal to me or anyone else how the vote stands on the question of guilt or other issues in this case unless I ask you to do so. Your verdict on each count and any finding must be unanimous. This means that to return a verdict, all of you must agree to it. Do not reach a decision by the flip of a coin or any other similar act. It is not my role to tell you what your verdict should be. Do not take anything I said or did during the trial as an indication of what I think about the facts, the witnesses, or what your verdict should be. And you must reach your verdict without any consideration of punishment. You'll be given verdict forms. As soon as all the jurors have agreed on a verdict, the foreperson must date and sign the appropriate verdict form and notify the bailiff. If you are able to reach a unanimous decision on only one or some of the charges, fill in those verdict forms only and notify the bailiff. Return any unsigned verdict form to me. Madam Clerk, let's swear in the deputy, please.
You do solemnly swear that you will take charge of this jury and take them to some private and convenient place where they may deliberate upon a verdict, and suffer no person or persons to communicate with them, including any form of electronic or wireless communication, nor to do so yourself, except to ask them if they have agreed upon a verdict or by the order of the court. And you will return them to this courtroom when they have agreed upon a verdict or by the order of the court, so help you God.
All right, with the 12 of you, take your personal items and with your notes and follow Daniel. My 4 alternates, please stay. All right, record reflect the jury has stepped out. The panel, we do have our 4 alternates here. Get your own special instruction. To the alternate jurors, the jury is now deliberating, but you are still alternate jurors and are bound by my earlier instructions about your conduct. Do not talk about the case or about any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, not even your family or friends, and not even each other. Do not have any contact with the deliberating jurors. Do not decide how you would vote if you were deliberating. Do not form or express an opinion about the issues in this case unless you're substituted in for one of the deliberating jurors. So what we'll do is this. In a moment, I'm going to have you write down on your notepad there your name and a cell phone number or phone number where we can all reach you, okay? If I need one of you for whatever reason, I'm going to throw all your names in a hat and pull out the winner, and that's the one we're going to call, okay? I'm going to send the jury home today at 4:30, and I'm going to have them back tomorrow morning at 9, and we'll do that until we hear a note from them that they've reached a verdict or there's some other issue we need to handle, okay? There's no need for you to come back today or tomorrow. We will call you if we need you, okay? Once we've received a verdict, we will call you and tell you. If we need you, we'll call you and tell you. Otherwise, You're just waiting until you hear from us, okay? Remember not to read or watch any media coverage nor form or express any opinion. If you'd be kind enough to leave your name and number on a piece of paper, you can leave your notes and your jury badge on your chair. If we need those, strike that. If we need you when you come back, we'll have those notes and your jury badge ready for you, okay? So if you've got that piece of paper ready, leave your badge and your notes on your chair and come on down. Leave Nancy that piece of paper and you can be on your way with the court's generous thanks.